Hi gang, welcome to Module 1. Now this is CTS1150. It's computer hardware and maintenance. What we're focusing on in this course is what you see on the screen. CompTIA A+ Core 1 exam. It's computing infrastructure. And what that essentially means is the physical structure of the computer, how it's set up, how they connect to each other, and what's in it, and how they work. Okay. So with that said, let's ease on into this first module and use the chapter. I'm not going to go page by page through it. Get us where we need to be. There we go. Okay, so to start out with, one of the first things that they focus on in the book is let's get your tools together and plan what it is we're going to do. Now, I was a mechanic for years, long before I got into IT. And you have to have the right tool for the right job. If you don't, there's some things that are going to happen, or there's a high probability things will happen. One, you could get hurt. Two, you could damage whatever it is you're working on. And the third one, which is the best case scenario, is you actually perform the task, but it takes an excessive amount of time. Okay? Or it may not even be performed correctly. Right? So with that said, always the right tool for the right job. So whatever it is you're going to do, make sure you have every tool you need, clean, functional, whatever it may be, prior to starting the job. Now, what kind of things do we need? Well, we'll need a nice clean workspace for one. Yes, that is a tool. Having a clean workspace is very important because we don't want dust, dirt, oil, any things like that coming in contact with the electronic parts. Aside from that, we want to have what's called an ESD, or an electrostatic discharge band or wristband that connects to the computer. Now, what is ESD? Now, our computers, or our system units as we're going to call them, the system unit is the box. Now, that box could be in the form of a laptop, a handheld device, or a desktop computer tower or server. In any case, it is the system unit, the unit where the entire system is encased. Right. So with that said, we've got this electronic device that's connected to a power supply, or the power supply, or I should say there's a power supply in our device. It's connected to a power source. Now, if I plug my system unit into the wall, I've got 110 volts coming from the wall. You may hear it said as 110, 115, 120. That's all the same because there's a little bit of fluctuation. As long as it's approximately 110, 115, we won't have any problems with our device. Now, once that power comes from the source into the power supply of the unit, our power supply in the system unit then converts it to different forms of electricity depending on the needs of the system unit. Now, does a computer or a system unit store electricity? Well, not like you would think in the case of a battery, unless it is a battery in a laptop. And that's separate from what we're talking about in this instance. So we'll assume that we're not talking about a battery itself. So the system unit has that electricity coming from the source, and 110 volts, for most, it's not going to kill you. It will get your attention, but that's not to say that it cannot kill you. because it's not about the volts, it's about the amperage associated with that electricity coming from the source. Now, with that said, we've got a charge that we need to discharge in the system unit before we start doing anything. Now, we've got what are called capacitors in the computer. We've got them in the power supply, and we usually have them on the board in some way, shape, or form. Now, those capacitors, we need to discharge that electricity that it's not necessarily stored, it kind of lingers. Right? And we'll talk about it again in the future, but we need to discharge it. So first thing we need to do is unplug it from the wall or the power source and hold the power button down. And that will discharge any electricity that may be lingering within our system. From there, we need to worry about an electrostatic discharge or static electricity. Now, what happens is as we move around, our body and the things we come in contact with, our clothes, they create static electricity. And they hold the charge. We hold the charge on our body. It's not a significant charge. It may be if it's cold outside and you rub your feet back and forth on the carpet and you go touch somebody and you can actually hear it or they can feel it. That's a high level of an electrostatic charge that becomes discharged when you touch that other person. We don't want that to happen with an electronic device that is very sensitive to an electronic charge. All of our information is being stored in this computer in ones and O's. They're basically little electronic charges. And if they come in contact with an electrostatic discharge or that little shock, it could wipe out some data, it could corrupt data, it could damage an electrical unit, some component within our computer. So not only have we discharged, we've held that power button down, and I usually say 5 seconds to 10 seconds. Hold it down, just count to 10, and you're good. Have your electrostatic discharge strap or bracelet on connected to the system unit so that if you should have some static charge on your body, it will not damage your system. So we've got to have an ESD strap, a flathead screwdriver, a Phillips head screwdriver. I want to have some way of documenting what it is we're doing. I always take pictures with my cell phone. As from the time that I first had a cell phone and had camera capability, I've taken pictures of everything I'm working on. Because sometimes you forget, time may pass between when you disassembled something and when you're going to put it back together. Let's say you disassemble it, realize you're going to have to order parts for it. Those parts usually are not there within a matter of minutes. It's days, weeks, or even months. So now we've got to think back to what was it that we did to take this thing apart. So we've got to have some way of documenting it. Pictures are great. Some way to write down what it is we did to remind ourselves how this thing came apart and how it's going to go back together. Phillips head screwdriver, or some will call it a crosshair screwdriver or crosshead screwdriver. Torx screwdriver set. They're commonly used. There's two forms of Torx screwdrivers that you'll see today. One has a security component within the middle of it. The bits, or the screwdrivers themselves, essentially have a hole drilled right in the end of it. And that allows you to remove or tighten the specialty Torx bits. That's a security feature. Okay, so you may need two separate sets of Torx screwdrivers, but if you've got the security one, it'll work on the ones that are not security version. You'll need some tweezers, software. That's common. Need software to, it could be drivers or the OS. Make sure you have those things ahead of time. You may have to restore the operating system if you've got that DVD, CD, whatever it may be handy. That's a great resource. As well as the device that you're working on may not have a CD or DVD drive. It could be on a thumb drive. Okay, so you've got to think about the ways that you're going to access this device with software if you need. So with that said, a lot of these tools you may not have to have all the time, but it only takes once for you to need it, and if you don't have it, you're not able to perform whatever that task may be. Okay, so we've got to plan ahead what we're going to do, how we're going to do it. We want to open the case, and not all cases open the same way. So I hate wording it this way, but it's the best way given today's technology. Google the specific case or system unit that you're working on and see if somebody has a video online discussing how to open that specific case. Because some cases have little tips or tricks, or there's something special about opening that case. Most cases are very traditional on how they open. You'll put a little bit of force on them and slide them back, one panel or another, and it's good to know which one. There's usually a couple of screws that hold it together, so you would remove the screws and then take the case apart. Always have that ESD strap on before you go to open the case. Always have it unplugged from the wall and discharge any power that may be in the system unit. All right, so those are first and foremost. You need to identify the components that are in your system unit. Always keep some canned air to be able to blow out any dust, debris that may be in there. Use the tweezers to remove any physical things that you may see that could obstruct airflow or get caught up in the fans. All right. Never, I repeat, never spray a fan with canned air. Just please do not do it. There's a high probability you'll damage the fan with that canned air because they're not designed to spin as fast as canned air will spin them. If you do need to spray or remove some dust from a fan, use a tool, could be tweezers or a screwdriver or something, to lightly hold the fan blade in place while you spray it so it does not rotate, spin up, and damage any bearing surface. Now, we make sure everything's clean before we start working on it. We don't want any dust, dirt, whatever it may be, getting in any of the connections. I want to work on a clean area, clean surfaces, and clean parts. So once we've made sure everything's clean, we need to make sure we can identify everything that's there. Now we'll talk later about, in a future chapter, we'll talk about the different form factors of motherboards. Now motherboards are not all created equal. They're different sizes. They're fairly standard shapes, but over time they have changed to a degree. And you need to know what the form factor is. That'll help you identify the different connectors that exist and document everything that's there. Here's what's there. Here's how much RAM is in it. Here's the processor that exists. Document everything as you go, so that should there be any confusion, you need to come up with an answer. Somebody says, what processor's in there? I've got that written down right here. Okay. Be prepared to have to answer questions should the need arise. You'll get used to opening these system units, and you'll have all these little tools. We've kind of gone over them. There's your strap. You want to have gloves to protect your fingers from any sharp edges or anything. A power tester. Here's a power supply tester. We've got a USB, could have software, the CDs that we talked about. It's a multimeter. Actually have that, almost that exact one at home. A flashlight, we may not see what's going on in there, and wipes to be able to wipe things off. So here's an image of somebody with the grounding strap or ESD strap. It's on your body and connected to the system unit or the case. Note that it is unplugged. Okay. Now let's move forward a little bit. Let's look at a case as it sits here, and what do we see? Now we've got the door for an optical drive. Optical drive is CD drive, DVD drive. We've got USB connections. We've got different kinds of connections, sound. We may have video connections on the back, but these are microphone speaker connections. And we need to be able to identify each one of these connections. So here's an example of a VGA port. It's a video graphics array. Now this port is very common in being able to connect a display peripheral to the system unit, meaning we're going to hook a monitor up or some way to output an image from the system unit. But we need some way to interact with a computer, and that's the best way that we've come up with as a society to have the computer show us images so we can understand what's taking place and what's going on. All right. There are network connections that we may use, and like I said before, always press that power button down. Make sure it's plugged in to discharge any electricity. Now, it's good to have maybe a little plastic cup or some kind of box to hold your pieces and parts, your screws, whatever it may be. Now, as I said, I was a mechanic for years prior to getting in IT. As a mechanic, I worked on a lot of cars, trucks, boats, airplanes. There's not much that I haven't worked on. And one of the things that I have several of are these little magnetic parts trays. That's all well and good when it comes to working on a car or working on a motorcycle. But do not use anything magnetic when working on computer parts. You do not want to have magnetized screws. So, like I said, just use a plastic cup or something along those lines. All right, so we will open the case up, and we've got things that over time may not have been part of the system unit. They are now being integrated into this system unit or into the motherboard. Used to be that we would have a motherboard, the sound, the graphics, the network, all of those components or capabilities were optional. And they were boards that you literally plugged into the motherboard. Now today, if you could see here at the back of the system unit, these are on board or integrated into the motherboard components, which are digital, or I should say display ports, networking ports, USB ports, audio video ports. One of the things that you'll need to do in this first module is become familiar with each and every one of these ports. What they look like, what connects to them, the electricity that they may have associated with them, the capacity associated with them, meaning like a network connection. Not all network connections are the same. Some are faster than others. Be able to identify or distinguish different types of USB ports. USB ports are not all the same. There are different USB ports. So being able to identify them at a glance and know why they're different, how they're different. That is a requirement for this course. Okay, so we'll go through the steps and disassemble the computer. Don't go disassemble your family member's computer and say, I've got to do this for my class. Don't do that. If it's something somebody's using for work, has to use for school, don't go taking them apart. I've got virtual machines that we'll use in these labs. Okay, and we go through and we talk about in the text what a motherboard is, how it works, and here are those onboard ports that I discussed. Now, this image right here is a great resource for completing the mind tap exercise when it comes to identifying the different ports and what they do. So become familiar with each one of these ports, and there's an arrow coming from what it is. There are a total of 6 USB 2.0 ports. There are 2 blue USB 3.0 ports. They are different in speed and throughput, as well as they're visually different. Blue identifies the 3.0. The traditional black port is 2.0. Okay, so we've got eSATA ports. Become familiar with each one of the ports and each one of the components as they're described in these 2 figures. These 2 figures are very important moving forward with the labs. Okay. Now, remember I said there are cards or boards that we used to have, that these things were not on board in the past, and now they are. In the past, they would have been on cards like this. Now, we still have things on cards. We still have network cards, but the most common card that we'll see is a display card. And the display cards have, in many cases, their own little processor on board on the card, which requires a fan to keep it cool. And with that said, we would have to make sure that it's inserted into the right slot. And when we get to the motherboard portion of this course, you'll become more aware of the different types of slots, the electricity that is in one slot but not in another. So all slots are not all the same, just like these ports all are specialized, each one for something different. The slots are as well. So you have to be able to distinguish one slot from another. Now in this image, we see memory, or RAM, random access memory, plugged into memory card slots. Okay. Now, we'll talk more about RAM in another module, and in that other module, we'll go into the different types of RAM, the speed of the RAM, and the importance of RAM. At this point, just be able to identify that we have what in this case is dual inline memory modules. They are RAM, and they are on the motherboard. They're, like I said, we'll talk more about that moving forward. All right, we've got an example of a hard drive, and here's another example of a hard drive, 2 different types, and here's an optical drive, or a CD drive, DVD drive. Okay. Now, the system unit has different wires and connections in it, and over time you'll become familiar with what each wire is, how they connect, why they connect, where they connect. Now, with that said, our system unit that we may deal with has that power supply. So what's behind this little grate or this little grill here is a power supply. This plug connects our power supply to a power source, which is a plug in the wall. We've got 2 options. This little switch right here will toggle between we'll usually see 120 and 240. Remember I said you may see it referred to as 110, 115, 120. It's roughly all the same. That's a standard US voltage. These system units have the ability, or the power supplies have the ability, to be switched over to what's traditionally in South America or Europe, which is a higher voltage power source. It's just a matter of flipping that over, and then you can plug into the higher voltage power source. Be aware of where you are and what power source you are connecting to. In the US, you're going to see 110, or like I said, 115. This may say 120. It's all synonymous with what we're dealing with. So make sure it's set to that voltage. The amperage, which is something different, we'll talk about that when it comes to power sources and power supplies. Amperage, for the most part, what we'll see, we won't see a power source with any higher than about 30 amps. And most of what we'll use would be a 15 amp. Like I said, we'll talk about that later. I noted that different motherboards have what we call different form factors. And that's the shape and size of the motherboard, the footprint of it, if you will, in the case. Okay. Those form factors require different combinations of connections and cables. So we have to be able to identify each one. Here's an example of a 4-pin Molex. So in this first module, there's a lot of things that you'll have to just remember based on sight. It's kind of like when you were young, remembering vocabulary words or how to spell certain words. This is that same kind of skill that you have to acquire, and it's practice. Sit down and go over this over and over again. We've got flashcards in MindTap that you can go and practice what these connections look like and what they do. All right. It's important resources for us. So if you saw a picture, you would need to be able to identify, oh, that's a 20 plus 4 pin. That's a 24 pin. That's a 20 pin. Right. So these are things that we need to be able to identify and know what are they. Well, in this instance, they are plugging the power supply into the motherboard. Right. And each one is for a different type of motherboard. Here's another power supply or power connection feeding the motherboard. It's a 4-pin 12-volt connector. Each one of these little connections in the connector has a different voltage. They have a different purpose. So that power supply takes that 110 volts and converts it into a variety of different types or forms of electricity to be used in different ways and different components within the motherboard and connections on the motherboard. All right, so there's things that we'll need to know. Okay, you need to know about each one. Now there's that table right there. Know each one of those 4. Know everything you see on this figure 1-20. Okay. So this is not like, and I said it in the welcome video, this is not like a programming course where you just get used to performing a task. There's rote memorization that you're going to have to be able to do or know. What is this 8-pin connector? What does it do? How does that differ from a 4-pin connector? Right. Like I said, each connection means something different. You don't have to memorize each one of these little connections on a 24-pin to know what they are for this course or for the exam. But what you do need is a resource to be able to know that this one right here is 3.3 volts. It's connected to the orange and brown wire, and you can put your multimeter on there and see, do I have 3.4 or 3.3 volts there? tested to see is it working properly. Now we've got a power supply tester. We just plug that in and it'll let us know, is it doing what it's supposed to do, and it'll tell us what the issues are. Okay. So know the connections for video cards, and that's what this is an example of, a video card. Here's our board. The processor would sit here, fan over the top of it. We've got expansion cards or expansion slots, and we've got excuse me, slots for memory, RAM. Okay. So with that said, go through step by step everything that we've got in this chapter. Become familiar with each one of the connections. They're not all labeled, but depending on the system, they may be. Okay. They'll plug in a specific order. The motherboard a lot of times has writing on it that's here. This is where you're going to put the reset switch. This is where the speaker plugs in. The different components will plug into different things, and we need to be clear on what gets plugged in and where. Now, you remember that one tip that I gave you earlier? Take pictures. If you take pictures, it helps you remember what goes where. Be cautious with the power supply. Make sure you've discharged the power supply before you remove it. It's usually only 4 screws that hold it in. Then it'll slide out. We've got a power supply tester. You don't even need to take it out to test it. Okay. We can connect a hard drive through a variety of different cables. Here's an example of a SATA cable. We've got SATA cables, PATA cables, and over time you'll become familiar with the different cables. We've got the labs that you'll go through, and I'll create a video to help you get an understanding of how to interact with the labs. But the labs are going to help you with that memorization, remembering what things look like and what they are. All right. I could sit here and tell you this is 3.3 volts and why it is that way. But 9 times out of 10, that's not going to stick in your memory just because I said it. Little things like remember to take pictures. Now, this is the 3rd time I said remember to take pictures. That's starting to stick for you. Being in the labs and going through the labs time and time again, that will help. Spend as much time as you can in these labs becoming familiar with the different components. Okay. So we've got different types of laptops, desktops. We've got servers. We've got ways to input to the system. Then the system will output a printer, a display monitor. We've got docking stations that we can connect the system unit to. Ways to connect the computer to a network. So we may have network devices that we may connect the computer to. So a variety of different things that we could connect to. And one of the things is on a computer or on the system unit, if it's coming from a manufacturer, they usually put some labeling on it to identify the model, when it was manufactured, where it was manufactured. Based on that information, we can go to the manufacturer's website and get all the information we need about how it was configured, what options it could have had from the factory. And then we can go get instructions on how to better disassemble it. Remember I said, the right tool for the right job. Use the manufacturer's website as a tool. There's oh my God, the amount of information that's available to us on the manufacturer's website is absolutely incredible, and they update it regularly. All right, there's diagnostic tools that you can download that come with instructions on how to use those tools to diagnose issues with your computer. There's some of the tools that we used or looked at. Remember I said, go watch videos when you can, because a lot of times manufacturers will hide screws. Screws aren't pretty, so they may hide them, and you've got to go find them somewhere to be able to disassemble these system units. Laptops, pulling keyboards off of a laptop can be quite tricky, depending on the manufacturer and the specific model. Okay. So we're going to be very cautious in how we take things apart. Know how they go together before you try to take things apart. Never rush disassembly. Never force disassembly. Okay. Take these things apart step by step, and sometimes they are quite sequenced in how you have to disassemble them and reassemble them. You have to follow a specific procedure on how to do it. But once you become familiar with how to disassemble and assemble the systems, it becomes second nature. That's the easy part. The difficult part, as I said, is remembering each little part, how they go together, what they do at a glance, being able to identify them. Okay. Now, we're going to need to know what are the guidelines for maintaining systems, both a traditional system unit or desktop unit, as well as laptops. Okay. So read through this overview at the end of the chapters, chapter summary. We'll go through each of, go ahead and close this and come into this module 1. The read part, that was just there. I usually go to the book to the right, go through those flashcards, go through that test prep, spend the time on it. Lab manuals are not graded. That doesn't mean you can't do them. You can see here, a lot of people have gone through and done it. 8 out of 26 people have already completed that first lab manual. Don't focus so much on the lab manuals first. If you've got extra time, go back and get those done. This first module, I always had a lot of time to try and get this one done, get these things knocked out. Focus on this 1.1 lab. Jump in there. Go get this lab done. Remember I said, use that book, those images, to supplement it. So I can have on the same screen, on the left side of the screen, I can have this going on, and I can come over on the right, just like this, and go back into chapter 1, and I can go look at the different connections. Okay. Now, let's see, where was I? It was somewhere in here. I can go back and look at the connections and be able to identify which ones are which. All right. I'm going to dig deeper into, like I said, these labs. They're not difficult. Remember what kind of connection this was? It says, click the connect port, or the correct port on the PC for the male DB15 connector. Where's this going to go? I'll drag it and I'll drop it. Boom, it'll work that easy. Okay, I'll tell it, hey, show me, and it'll go through and it'll
The
explain
VGA
to me.
port carries analog video support to devices including PCs and video game consoles.
It's that simple. Drag it. It's hanging up on me. For whatever reason, it could be because, it's probably because I'm recording that it's not giving me that interactability with this system. And it's common where it'll prevent me from being able to do things. Like I said, I'll create a video on exactly doing this. I may have to set the camera up and record the screen that way. But Go through these labs, go through them over and over again to get the exposure until you know, I know exactly what this is, I know what this is, I know what this port is, I know what that port is, I understand what these are, what they do. Each one of these, get used to what they are, how they work. Okay? All right. If you got questions, concerns, jump into the assignment support forum. Ask your fellow classmates, because it's probably a been there, done that for them. All right. So I'll see you in the class, see you in the discussions. Have a great week.